The other thing that the social entrepreneurs have is they tend to not have, or they tend to have multiple ways of looking at the world. So for example, they don't just look at the world as an economist, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or an environmentalist. They tend to have more than one background interest. So they can see, oh, this is how a lawyer would look at it, but this is how the environmentalist would look at it, but this is how the policymaker would probably look at it. So having multiple exposures to different sectors and different cultures enables them to generate more creative ideas. Because many of the problems of the world come from the fact that too many people only have one model for looking at the world. And it's really at the intersection of models that social change happens. It's where, it's where the models come together. If you all think about Steve Jobs as a perfect example of a great social innovator, one of the things people don't know about Steve Jobs was that he was a computer geek. He was a total computer nerd who loved them since he was a kid. But he also took a calligraphy course when he was in college. It was his favorite course. He loved beautiful calligraphic writing. And when you think what distinguishes the Macintosh from all the other computers is its sense of design. The Macintosh introduced fonts, different fonts to all. Before they came along, it was all IBM, and Courier 12-point was the only choice you had. And nobody thought it was a problem until Steve Jobs came along and said, this is not very aesthetic. So think about that. He had this exposure to a non-computer aesthetic experience that informed everything he did for the rest of his life and has changed. I just heard that there were a few thousand people outside the Apple store last week, right? So it obviously resonates with people in Hong Kong. So multiple exposures. The other thing that's very important if you're interested in social innovation is every time I meet somebody who is solving a social problem, I ask them, what do you think the 5 most significant innovations are in the world in your field today? And the thing is, they usually have a really good answer. They've thought about it. So people who are social innovators map out all the innovations in their field. They become quite knowledgeable about their field, and they can tell you, so-and-so in Australia is doing this, so-and-so in Thailand is doing this, so-and-so in California is doing this, and they understand all the different innovative spaces. So they map it out for themselves. Because that understanding the history of problem solving in the field you're in is very, very helpful. You understand what the opportunities are, but you also understand what all the mistakes are that other people have made, where things broke down. So those are a few examples of things that, that could help if you are interested in becoming a social innovator. But I think the biggest decision that people have to make, and this is I'm going to wrap up in a minute so we have time for questions, is ultimately the main question we all have to ask ourselves is, we have to make choices in life. What are we willing to do without? And what are we not willing to give up? Okay? I have a friend recently who is a graduate of Yale Law School. And he went to his 25th anniversary of Yale Law School. He's older than me. And he said something to me that really struck me. I said, how was it? He said, everybody's bored. Everybody's completely bored in their work. I said, really? He said, yeah. He says, they hate their jobs. Now, these are the people who graduate from pretty much the most prestigious university in the United States, or one of them, who have chosen a profession that puts them in the top 0.1% in terms of earning and power and all that. And they're miserable. They don't like it. How could you consider that success? So most of the time when we think about risk, what we can't do without, we think about making money, economic stability, all these things. I don't actually think that that's the biggest risk in life. My guess is that there's very few people in this room, if any, who really are at risk of being homeless or going hungry or really, really not having enough money to live a basic existence. We're not, in Bangladesh, and where survival is really the risk for people. Okay? The risk, I think, for most people is, what if you end up doing something for 40 years that just doesn't really turn you on? What if you end up landing in a job that's not in your, that is just, you really don't care about your work that much? We don't usually think of that as a risk. It's not up there like, you know, getting sick or going bankrupt. But if you think about it, that's kind of existential risk, if you think about it. It's the risk of not having lived your life. It's like not having shown up to the game of your own life, in a sense. And I think it's a risk worth keeping in mind. Is this putting me in that direction of risk? One of my favorite quotes is from the humorist Mark Twain. He said, "My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened. I think that's kind of true for me. It's true for my dad, for sure. It's true for a lot of us. So people do this work. It doesn't pay as well as the private sector does yet, although the salaries are improving, and there's social enterprise can certainly make a profit. I do not think that it will make the kinds of profits that it can be made in full enterprise, because by definition, you're always going for harder business. You're always going for harder customers. You're always going for products that the private sector decided it didn't want. So to some degree, it's always going to have a greater degree of difficulty, and I think it will have lower returns. That's okay. It has much higher returns and is much more able to deal with existential risk. So capacity grows. All of these things that I'm talking about, when you hear these stories, none of these people had the ability to pull them off when they started. They only had the ability to take the first step. As you start working on something, your ability to solve that problem comes, but you don't have it when you start. Nobody begins a task being able to complete that task. People begin the task with the ability to begin the task. The rest of it comes along the way, and I think that that's a really important thing to remember. So I'd like to just end with two quotes. One of them is from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It says, "A single event can awaken within us a stranger totally unknown to us. To live is to be slowly born. To live is to be slowly born." And I'd like to conclude with a poem called Hope by the Chinese poet Lu Xun, which I love. I love this poem. I think it really summarizes what we're seeing today in the world. Hope is like a path on the mountainside. At first, there is no path, but then there are people passing that way, and then there is a path.